What's up, y'all? Welcome to the random U.S. history, government and AP U.S. history teacher's room. But we're not going to be talking about government or AP U.S. history today because I'm not a government or AP U.S. history teacher. I'm a substitute. So we're going to give you some low-quality education today. This video is meant to serve as an introduction to a series of videos I plan to create. Introducing somebody to the body of work of Arthur Schopenhauer, and also just to Western philosophy in general, or just philosophy in general, whatever. I pick Arthur Schopenhauer for a few reasons. I'm probably the most familiar with his shit and with Nietzsche's shit. I think they're both the shit. A lot of interest in the world about Nietzsche. He's probably like the most popular philosopher among most people. But I remember when I first tried reading Nietzsche, there was a lot of stuff that just went completely over my head. I didn't know what he was talking about. I kind of discovered Schopenhauer independently. And then coming back to Nietzsche after having read Schopenhauer made a lot more sense, because a lot of the things that Nietzsche is doing is like responding to kind of Nietzsche's interpretation of his own system. I kind of have tended to think about Nietzsche as somebody who kept a lot of Schopenhauer's system intact, the way that he saw the world, the way that he kind of divvied it up, but he very much disagreed with Schopenhauer's kind of interpretation of his own system. We don't ever sense Nietzsche really, and just sense these big German dudes and shit. We don't really have a lot of system building philosophy. I don't know, like the postmodernists in them. I haven't really got that much into them, but they've kind of critiqued the idea of like a totalizing meta narrative, which is a lot of what like a philosophical system is. We don't really believe in that sort of thing anymore. So we've I don't know if just philosophers that have done that have not made it to the level where they're studied by most people. Maybe 100 years from now we'll have discovered some really good system builders from this time that we were neglecting on account of our inheritance of the postmodern tradition type shit. But Schopenhauer is definitely one of the last great dudes to do that. And I think his system holds up in a lot of ways as like a very coherent way to view the world as will and representation. This whole transcendental idealism thing, I think, deserves a lot more credit than it gets. I think Schopenhauer is unique in that he's a super clear writer and thinker. In the first book we're going to get into, he has like a little simile that I really like, that I think about all the time, that like a genuine kind of philosopher is going to be not turbid and blah blah blah, but it's going to be clear like a Swiss lake, like with the clarity only revealing the depth, right? He's not trying to confuse you with all these different concepts and word games and trying to just be obscure, and he's not difficult in the sense that like Hegel's his favorite dude to just constantly shit on, which is a ton of fun. He does it all the time. But Hegel's famous for being very difficult to make any sense of. Schopenhauer's not really that way. He's very much clear. But the problem is that the first, like at the beginning of his major book, World is Will and Representation, he tells you need to like be completely, like first read all of Kant and be familiar with Kant, and then also read my dissertation on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. Be familiar with that, because it's really an introduction to this book. And if I hadn't already written it before, it would have been at the beginning of this book. So you need to understand that first. Big task, big ask. I think I don't really think you need to read all of Kant to understand Schopenhauer. I don't think it would be outrageous to say that Schopenhauer does Kant better than Kant did. Like he clears up a lot of the confusing conceptual misalignments that happen in Kant. and he applies them in a way that's a lot more coherent and easy to understand. It's kind of a theme with this guy. But the principle of sufficient reason, or the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, his dissertation is, it can be pretty hard to get through. It's pretty, like, I remember first time I was reading it, like the whole beginning part where he walks through all of the thinkers before him and all this stuff, and then he gets into this whole section on optics that's really long, and it can be really kind of dry and you don't really know what's going on. So the goal with these videos is to introduce you to Schopenhauer by going through the beginning of, or by going through the fourfold root, so that you could get yourself into reading it on your own, easier without starting it and giving up. If you're somebody who doesn't have a lot of time to read, you might not make it that far in that book, because you're like, what the fuck. Same with The World is Will and Representation. He's a brilliant writer, but the way that his system is laid out means that in the first book on representation, it ends up being pretty dry and mathematical and things in a way that can be really hard to get through the first few chapters to get into the beauty of the whole thing. So I'm somebody who does not recommend a whole lot of secondary literature. I think it's a lot better to engage with the major works themselves. I think you just get a lot more out of it, even just like struggling through a chapter of something that's hard to get through, that takes you a lot of time. I think it is going to be a lot more rewarding than trying to get it secondhand, because people, especially with Schopenhauer, the thing that you get all the time with this guy is just that he's like the great pessimist. I think it's pretty telling that Nietzsche, who was like the greatest Schopenhauerian for most of his life, or most of his sane life or whatever, said, like, because Schopenhauer wasn't a pessimist, no matter how much he wanted to be or whatever, he wasn't really a pessimist. I think reducing Schopenhauer to pessimism is just kind of a ridiculous way to view his system. He doesn't really even get into pessimism until, except for in his little, he inserts little comments referencing what happens later in the work, but it's not until like the fourth book on ethics that he really even gets into that sort of thing that much. And I guess kind of in book 2 as well. But it's not that important to Schopenhauer to think of him as a pessimist, unless you're thinking of him in terms of him versus versus Nietzsche. But as far as the system itself, I think it's a really beautiful and coherent way to organize your thinking about the world and about philosophy if you're first getting into it. I know one hurdle when you're first getting into philosophy, besides like those major like canonical works being like just dense and you don't know what they're referring to and they're just confusing, they all have so many like prerequisites. You have to have read this and that and the other in order to know what's going on here, which can be very difficult when you're first starting. But the other thing is that there's all these like big words that get thrown around as different branches of philosophy, like metaphysics and epistemology, and they're not usually very clear what they're supposed to mean or how they fit in, or what, people use them in different ways. I think Schopenhauer's system gives you a really clear way of organizing where those things fit in. I would say like World is Will and Representation is really, if you take it really broadly, it's first book epistemology, second book metaphysics, third book aesthetics, fourth book ethics. And so getting into his epistemology in the first book, the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, is going to be a really handy tool for making sense of that and just for making sense of the world in general, because we're not really about making sense of Schopenhauer here. We don't give a shit about Schopenhauer. We give a shit about what's, like real and true, if you want to get all grandiose about it. But you want to, like what's right about what he says. It's not about him or scholarly work on Schopenhauer. It's about, like, I think a lot of the shit that dude said was just pretty true and holds up. He was very influential, obviously, to Nietzsche, but also to like Einstein loved reading Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer talks a lot about like the intimate union of space and time as a condition for the possibility of experience. So you could see why that intimate union of time and space thing would be appealing to Einstein. Schopenhauer presages Freud, I like to say, in a lot of ways. And Freud's theory of the unconscious is kind of indebted to Schopenhauer having previously stood everything on its head and saying, no, guys, it's not rationality and intellect that is the highest principle. And we see this even today in like David Chalmers and the kind of metaphysician people wanting to make consciousness like the root of all things or whatever. And Schopenhauer's like, it doesn't make sense to think of it that way, because clearly will is prior to intellect, and he has some really brilliant chapters on that idea that maybe we can get into sometime. Schopenhauer's great as an introduction to philosophy also because in the essay, The Fourfold Root that we've talked about, but also in his last book, Parerga and Paralipomena, he has sections where he goes through all of the prominent Western thinkers leading up to him from he doesn't really deal with the pre-Socratics that much, but you can get into Nietzsche for that. But like Plato and Aristotle, and then through a few of the medieval people and up to, like Locke, Kant, Hume, and them. And like he just walks through the tradition and says how they fit into it and how he fits into it in relation to them and how he's expanded on them. So it gives you like a way to kind of jump off to each of those people and understand them in a sort of larger context that is handily provided for you. He's great as a bridge too into Eastern philosophy. He kind of famously arrived at his system as like a young man, like 26 to 30 in that area, before he had really gotten into, like, he was working at a time when translations of Eastern philosophy were coming into Germany. And so he had already kind of arrived at his system before engaging with those works, and he saw those as kind of like a corroboration of him having arrived at these conclusions in a very different context from a post-Kantian sort of situation, and then seeing that these people were saying the same sorts of things thousands of years ago in India and stuff like that. And he talks about Buddhism and things, so it gives you kind of a way to conceptualize the whole relationship between those sorts of things. Let's see, what else do we like about Schopenhauer? He's a clear writer, gives you jumping off points to the rest of the West before him, the East, and straight into Nietzsche, who is a great window to the present. Coherent way of looking at the world. I think that says a lot of it. So, like I said, I'm a substitute. So the idea for this channel is that I'm a substitute for like engaging with the actual works. Like that is what you should be doing, is reading those actual books. I'm here to just fill in for the day and give you a little bit of inspiration to appreciate the actual teacher a little bit more, because we subs do not provide a high quality education like you can get from the books themselves. But I might be able to, help you appreciate those more and just help you get a little bit more out of them when you read them. Sometimes it can be helpful to listen to somebody who's just done it a couple more times than you to allow you to get more out of it when you engage with it yourself, or just get you over some kind of hurdle. So that's the idea. So the plan is to start with the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason as his introduction to his larger work before maybe his essay on the freedom of the will, which is a really good kind of standalone essay as an argument. I don't know, freedom of the will is always kind of a hot topic in philosophy, and I think that his essay on it just kind of blew me away the first time I read it. It seems like a really pretty solid argument, but I remember the first time I read it too, that I got to the end of it about, he kind of says like, well, we can't really resolve this problem without understanding like transcendental idealism is the solution to it. And I'm like, what the hell do you even mean? I don't know what you're talking about, dude. And you didn't explain it well at all. So I think that going through that essay and leaving off at that point would give us a great means to jump into the major work and talk about what transcendental idealism is for Schopenhauer, and how it holds up kind of today too, and just kind of walking through his system so that we can start making sense of all these different things. So I think if I have anything else here that I forgot. I've tried to do this intro video a couple times and I keep fucking it up and having to redo it. Hoping this is the one. I think that's, it's good enough for today. So stick with me. I think we'll get a lot out of this shit. See you in some other teacher's classroom. Welcome to substitute philosophy or whatever.